Hi, everyone. Welcome. We see folks are starting to join. We're so excited that you're here for our webinar. Hope you're doing well in the many different places people are calling in from. We're gonna wait about a minute or so to let other folks come in. So just sit tight and we'll be here soon. But yeah, thanks so much for being with us today. Yeah, feel free to, in the chat, introduce yourself. You can share any information you'd like your name, where you're calling from, if you're a part of any school or organization or kind of work you do, we'd love to hear from you. Folks just joining. We're gonna be starting in just a minute.
It's always great to see where folks are tuning in from.
Looks like we got people from both coasts, some people from New York, some people from the Bay Area, Michigan, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. Really exciting to see so many folks joining. Thank you for being here. We know it's evening for some folks, later in the afternoon for others. Very exciting. All right, so you know some more people might be trickling in over the next few minutes, but we have a very jam-packed hour, lots that we want to talk about with you all. So we're gonna get started. First, just a few norms for our webinar, just to share as we get started. We are recording this webinar, and so all registrants are going to be able to get a link to the recording in a follow-up email. So if you have to step out early, no worries. You'll be able to see the full recording. If you need automated captions, they are available in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you're having any trouble with that, just shoot us a message in the chat and we'll try to help you. We do have, because we're in the webinar format for Zoom, please use the Q&A tool rather than the chat box to ask questions throughout the webinar. We're going to have a Q&A section at the end. So if you can put the questions in the Q&A tool, that helps us to be able to sort out the questions. So because sometimes the chat is very active and we want to make sure we don't miss anything. We're going to try to answer all the questions at the Q&A section. If we're not able to get to everything, we'll do our best to reach out over email and make sure that we address those questions. But yeah, we really encourage folks to use the chat box as you're already doing to introduce yourself, share, where you're based out of, anything you want to share, who you work with. And we want to acknowledge that, especially for folks who are calling throughout the so-called Americas, and acknowledge the unceded indigenous lands that we're calling from. We know we're all calling from a lot of different places. And so a great place, if someone might not know whose land you are based on, is to go to native-land.ca. And I believe we'll be putting that link in the chat in just a sec. It's a great way to find out more information about the peoples and communities whose land you're based on. And because we know that action is so important to go beyond just acknowledgement, we encourage folks, if you haven't already, to find out more about the local Indigenous communities and organizations and advocacy groups in your area. We like to shout out, since most of us are based in the Bay Area, we like to shout out to Gorite Land Trust, which is led by Ohlone women in what is known as the Bay Area. So we'll also drop a link to Segorite. They're a really cool organization, and just encouraging folks to, as much as you can, take action and act in solidarity with our Indigenous relatives. All right. So we're just going to do a quick round of introductions. I'm really excited to be joined by an awesome group of collaborators and friends for this hour to talk about storytelling for social change. My name is Ella Banerjee. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Community Partnership Manager at Voice of Witness. I'm based on Ohlone land, also known as Berkeley, California. I've been with VOW for a little over 6 years now. I'm really excited for this session and excited to see so many people joining us. And I'm going to pass it over to Jessica to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Jessica Fagan. I also use she, her pronouns, and I am the education manager at Voice of Witness. I am calling in from unceded Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone lands, aka Oakland, California. I will pass to you, Fanny.
Hello, everyone. My name's Fanny Garcia. I'm based in Lenapehoking, which is known as Harlem nowadays. And I've been with WOW for about 5-6 months now. I'm super happy to have joined them. And my pronouns are she, her. I'm also a freelance oral historian working primarily in immigration narratives. And I'll pass it over to Risha.
Everybody, I'm Risha Chansky. I'm a professor in the Department of English at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayaguez, where I also direct the Oral History Lab, and we work on a lot of different social justice and climate justice projects across the archipelago. And I work with a great team on recording interviews, preserving interviews, and then disseminating interviews so that we can move climate information from stories into the multiple different communities that need them. And I'm glad to be here tonight.
Thanks you all. And special shout out to Risha, who is one of the editors of one of our Voice of Witness books, which we're going to talk about in a lot more detail in a bit, but we're super excited that she's able to join us today. So thanks so much, Risha. All right, so we've shared a little bit about ourselves. We want to hear from you all. We know that people joining, some people might be long-term friends of Voice of Witness. Some people, maybe you've just heard about us, and people are coming, we know, with a lot of different levels of experience or familiarity with oral history. And so we'd love to just take a quick poll. It should be popping up, I believe, on your Zoom screen now or very shortly, just to get a sense of how familiar people are with oral history storytelling. We know some people have already been practicing oral history for a number of years, have maybe completed their own projects. Some people maybe are completely new and you're learning about it for the first time here. We want to welcome everybody for joining, and all these different levels. Everyone has a lot of insights to share and a lot to learn. So we're going to open the poll and leave it open for about a minute or so for people to share their responses. If you're having trouble at all, you can put a question in it in the chat. Okay. All right, I'm seeing, I think people have, it sounds like most people have shared. I'm seeing that we kind of have a mix. Some people who completed an oral history project is about 24%, but we have people, another 25% are people who are interested in starting an oral history project. 17% of people are working on an oral history project, and 34%, actually the largest number, are new to oral history. So it's really awesome. Thank you all for sharing your experience levels. It's really cool to hear that people are really coming from all different directions. That's really exciting. I think we have a lot to share with each other. All right, I'll share. Okay, I think I've shared the results. Now I'm gonna exit out of it. Okay, I'm still learning how to use that poll feature a little bit myself. So especially because we have some new folks who are learning about oral history, I'm going to pass it over to Jessica to talk a little bit about like what oral history really is and how we define it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ella. Yeah, let's establish a working definition of what is oral history. So, according to the Oral History Association, oral history is a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. Typically, what that looks like in practice is we have a well-prepared interviewer sitting down with the term that we use for the person sharing their story is narrator. So we have interviewer, narrator. Typically, their conversation or conversations are recorded, and then their exchanges are transcribed, edited. In some cases, they are presented out in audio format, video format. At Voice of Witness, with our book series, we commonly use text-based oral histories. And then to sort of add on to the definition for Voice of Witness, we really see oral history not just as a method of collecting stories, but also as an opportunity to democratize the idea of storytelling and to reclaim historical narratives. So we think that oral history can create spaces for stories that in some cases might not otherwise be shared by dominant mainstream media platforms. we think that oral history can fight erasure and exclusion and can really help to foster an empathetic understanding of people and historical events. So moving beyond the textbook or the sound bites or the statistics and moving into stories that can disrupt harmful narratives, stories that can be healing, right? That can allow narrators to reclaim their agency and share their own stories in their own words with complexity and dignity and agency. So with that, I'm going to pass back to Ella so she can talk a little bit about Voice of Witness and our mission and the work that we do.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. So yeah, Voice of Witness, we also are known as VOW from our initials. We're an oral history nonprofit and that started about 15 years ago, originally started in San Francisco, though now we have staff, we're national, we have staff who work on both coasts in San Francisco and New York and Arizona. And our mission is to advance human rights by amplifying the voices of people impacted by and fighting against injustice. So just to build off of what Jessica was just saying, we really believe in the transformative power of storytelling, and most especially for people to tell their own stories in their own words. So we really believe in first-person narratives, in flipping the script about who we often think about are the experts on different social justice and human rights issues, and really, honor and amplify the insight that people have who have lived experience, people who are directly impacted by these issues, but are so often not given the mic in mainstream media. So we really believe in storytelling and in first-person narrative and in people's right and ability to share their story in their own words. And so we have a few key programs that help us do our mission. The first is our oral history book series. We have about, I believe, 22 books in our oral history book series as of now, 22 and counting. There's always some in the works. Each book focuses on a specific social justice issue. Often different themes have included stories of migration, displacement, the criminal justice system in the US. There's a lot of different themes. In each book, we have a collection of narrators, somewhere between 12 to 15, and all of those folks share their life stories, essentially. We follow a birth to present day approach, so people aren't just sharing about you're not just reading about, one moment of trauma or one experience someone has had. Really, you're getting a sense of who someone is as a three-dimensional person. You're reading it in the first-person narrative too, and we really strive for a literary sense of detail. So it feels like you're reading a short story and really getting to step into someone's shoes. And by all these different narrators have slightly different experiences, but they're connected to this theme in different ways. So you get a collection, a better idea of, an understanding of the specific social justice issue in each book. In addition to our book series, we also have an education program, which Jessica is part of and helps run. This is where we bring these books to classrooms across the country. We have free curriculum developed for each of our books, so teachers can use lesson plans as they see fit to teach these issues in their classroom. But beyond that, it's also about teaching oral history and storytelling skills and empathy skills to students so that students can learn how to do their own oral history and interviews. They can amplify and gather the stories of their communities and their families and really see themselves in these different storytelling and narrative projects. Finally, we have our community partnerships program, which I help run, where we connect to other organizations who do more direct service with our narrator communities. So think legal aid services, mental health organizations, different people who are on the ground really doing grassroots advocacy. And we connect with them to see how our books and our storytelling resources can amplify the work that they're doing. We really believe in making that link between storytelling and change and action, that learning about people's stories can help change people's hearts and minds. They can really advocate for policy change and also build, do community building. So there's a lot that can come out of community partner work with oral history. And so we have a lot of opportunities. If people are interested in working with us to have trainings, we can customize them. If you are interested in your own storytelling project and want support, there's a huge range of services that we provide through our oral history skills and resources. So definitely reach out to us through our website, or we'll have an email at the end of the session. If you're interested in figuring out how you can work with Val, we really want to hear from you. All right, now to talk a bit more on this thread about oral history and how it relates to social justice, I'm going to pass it over to Fanny.
Thank you, Ella. Why oral history? Why is this important? We believe that oral history is a powerful tool against erasure and the misremembering of history, and has a wide range of benefits and applications. Many different communities, organizations, and practitioners in diverse fields can use oral history practices to support and improve their work. And oral history can be used to advance policy, facilitate understanding and community building, and to educate. For example, in 2019, as part of efforts to pass immigration reform legislation, an excerpt from Val's Solito Solita, an oral history project and book that documented stories from youth refugees from Central America, was read aloud on the floor of Congress by Representative Jackie Speer. Now, we may think like, did that really create social and immigration change given the moment that we're in? We don't know, right? We don't know. We can't measure that impact, but we cannot deny that there's something powerful about reading the stories of people with lived experience on the floor of powerful places. So in addition to advocacy and policy efforts, conducting oral histories can create collective connection and closure for communities who have experienced injustice. Oral history is also part of ethical storytelling, a much broader term that encompasses the practices of creating and sharing narratives with conscious commitment to respect, truth, fairness, and responsibility to the individual and the collective. And oral histories can contribute to narrative change efforts to combat harmful stereotypes and can be a tool for building strength and resilience in communities. And last but not least, Jessica's favorite, because she's in the education department, and all of us really as oral historians use oral history as a resource for education and research efforts to help us all understand how the past, present, and future are interconnected. We're not living in the present in isolation. We're in communication with what's happened before and what's going to happen in the future. So this is why we're so passionate about oral history. And I'm sure that many of these reasons are why you're also here today. And I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, Fanny. I just wanted to share as a way to sort of sum up Voice of Witness's stance on oral history, a quote from one of my favorite writers, Arundhati Roy. She says, "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." Of course, at Voice of Witness, we really appreciate this quote because it emphasizes that everyone already has a voice, right? Like, we're not in the business of giving anybody a voice, but rather we're in the business of creating a safe space for folks to share their voices and creating a platform to increase the impact of those stories. So we think that, you know, our mission is to sort of push back against the power structures that exist within our society to determine whose voices get heard and whose voices are intentionally silenced. And we think that community storytelling and oral history can help preserve those voices that do get preferably unheard or deliberately silenced. Okay, we're going to dive into a project. I'm going to pass off to Risha and Ella.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, on this thread of talking about community storytelling and preserving voices, I want to especially highlight Me Maria, which is a Voice of Witness book that was published in 2021, which Risha is one of the co-editors of. And so this project chronicles the experiences, the voices of people who lived through Hurricane Maria, which was a devastating storm that hit the Puerto Rican archipelago in September 2017. Did I get the year right, Risha? Thank you. Sorry, we had a moment of almost forgetting the year. My apologies. And people share in this project are sharing their experiences not only of living through the storm, but also living through the aftermath of the storm, of rebuilding, of really living through very poor response from the federal government, very little help from the government with dealing with this disaster, but also stories of community resilience and people working together to help their communities and to help each other. This is part of a project that's part of the Oral History Lab at the University of Puerto Rico Mayaguez, where Risha teaches, is and is an ongoing project. There's so many different things that Risha is working on with her team to continue the Me Maria project. So I want to pass it over to Risha and ask you, why you think it's so important to utilize oral history and first person narrative in relation to talking about, in particular, climate crisis and what happens after a climate disaster. Why is oral history such an important tool in this context?
Yeah, thank you, Ella. I think in our case, both the national news media and the government tried to erase the people of Puerto Rico after disaster. Then President Donald Trump said that Puerto Rico did not experience a real disaster, and that this particular hurricane in Puerto Rico had ruined his national budget. And so by sharing that dismissive language and then having that dismissive language picked up by the national news media, the relief, aid, funds, support was not forthcoming in Puerto Rico. And so that's an act of erasure. It's an act to say, I do not want to experience anything that might be distasteful to me, unpleasant to me, interrupt my own personal narrative. So by recording these stories, and not just recording these stories and having that witness transaction between the interviewer and the interviewee, but by amplifying these stories in a book in multiple other ways that we're amplifying them through the lab, means that we're disrupting that narrative. We're bringing attention to an issue. I wish that no one would ever go through what we went through in the Puerto Rican archipelago, but the very sad reality is that there are multiple communities, both within the United States and globally, that either have experienced climatological disaster or will experience climatological disaster soon. And we need to not only understand how people helped each other and how people helped their community, but what are strategies for addressing these disasters. And we live in a moment where, very unfortunately, this presidential administration is actively erasing climate stories and climate data. And so repositories like ours and the other oral history archives that have stories like this will become one of the only sources for people who need information on climate change and climate disaster.
Thank you so much, Risha, for sharing that. And yeah, just affirming everything that you said, especially right now. It's more important than ever to preserve these stories related to so many social justice issues, but especially climate crisis. So thank you for all the work that you do. And we'll be sharing more about the Me Maria project in just a little bit. But now, we've been talking so much about about what oral history is and its power, but we think it's really important to actually give people a chance to hear different excerpts of oral history so you get a chance to see, what it is we're talking about and to be able to read and listen to them yourself. So we've selected 3 different narrative excerpts from projects connected to Voice of Witness, and we've chosen these very specifically because they're all very different projects, and we want to show the breadth of what an oral history project can look like. There's a lot of different purposes that you can use with oral history. So the first example is from a shorter form online, mainly digital storytelling project that we did at Voice of Witness in partnership with different media outlets online. The second one is a collaboration with a partner organization where we were doing training with an organization staff. And the third one is going to be an excerpt from a book in the Bow series. So there's a big range of what oral history can look like. It's not necessarily a book or something like that. Other examples include doing podcasts or more audio-focused storytelling. There's been really amazing ways to combine visuals with written oral histories, including photo essays, zines, different graphic arts, really cool visual formats, and then having like pop-up exhibits, ways for people to physically interact and be immersed in these stories. So there's a lot of different ways to apply oral history. So I'm going to pass it now to Fanny, who's going to give our first example from Unheard Voices of the Pandemic.
Thank you, Ella. So as Ella mentioned, Unheard Voices of the Pandemic is an example of a shorter form oral history project published online with media partners. Voice of Witness interviewed narrators from a variety of our past oral history projects about updates in their life in the context of the 2020-2021 pandemic. And so we gathered all those stories and published them in a super cute, really touching book that you see on the screen right now. It's a small volume, but so powerful. And so the booklet is available via Haymarket if you wish to purchase it. I'll read an excerpt right now from our narrator. Sherrod McFarland is one of the narrators in 6x10 Stories from Solitary, another book that Val published and is also available through Haymarket. Mr. McFarland spent more than 30 years incarcerated, and this excerpt is from his interview, which was conducted in May of 2020. And when he conducted that interview, he was inside incarcerated at Parnell Correctional Facility in Jackson, Michigan. So the next slide is a quote from Mr. McFarland. He says, "Living under such conditions is already a high stress situation, which arguably negatively affects your immune system. But having to face the threat of a deadly pandemic ups the ante by 10. I'm not ashamed to say that the fear of death by coronavirus has crossed my mind many times. I'm in my 50s. I have asthma, and I've been in prison nearly 33 years straight, making me one of the more at risk. Some of the other men here are also quite vocal regarding their fears of the virus, but what can we do?" Mr. McFarland's words help me and us as a collective understand the personalized way in which people who were incarcerated experience the threat of illness and death. But he also shares with us another layer, and that is of the feeling powerless in this experience. So take a moment and imagine and consider this. I think it's a really powerful example of how to amplify voices of folks that might not otherwise have a microphone or a space to share their story. So it was really great that we were able to speak with Mr. McFarland. And I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Fanny. So this next project that we're going to learn about is an example of one of our community-based collaborations that we did with a partner organization. This one comes from the Koreatown Youth and Community Center. They came to us with a project called Our Story. Voice of Witness's involvement in this project was to train the staff and the volunteers to become bilingual interviewers so that they could collect and preserve intergenerational stories from their community that revolved around this MacArthur Park, which you can see a picture of here. So the project was to form a collective history of the space, the challenges of maintaining it, and of course the love that they have for public gathering and having togetherness time with their families. So the quote comes from Vanessa, one of the narrators from Our Story. She says, "When I came to this country almost 20 years ago, MacArthur Park was a place for the Hispanic community to come together. It was a place you could go and see people playing football, selling items, and chatting. It was a place for families to go, to have a picnic and a nice time. One beautiful memory I have at the park was with my family. At the time, my husband and I went with one of my girls to have a picnic with a blanket, sandwiches, and fruit. We watched the water and enjoyed the view. I spent the day talking to my daughter about my mom and dad. At the moment, I'm not comfortable taking my family to the park because of the smoking. One of my daughters has a history of asthma, so I'm concerned. We need to come together as a community to clean the park. Sometimes I see people throw their trash on the ground, even if the trash can is in front of them." I think that this brief excerpt from Vanessa can clearly exemplify how oral history can be used in a civic engagement space, in an advocacy space, This could be used as, some line of reasoning to promote investing and improving our public facilities. And the power, a lot of it comes from the fact that this is a firsthand account of how this space is used and how it's changed over time. All right, I'll pass to Risha for our third excerpt.
Thank you very much. In my case, I began my Voice of Witness storytelling project in the direct aftermath of Hurricane Maria. I was without electricity for 93 days, and so one of the cafes on the plaza in my town set up an industrial generator and a mobile hotspot. And so I started talking with the VOW book editor from that cafe. The owner of the cafe was nice enough to say that those of us who were still trying to work could use that space as their office. One of the interesting things about hooking up a power grid after it's collapsed is that each time you hook up a new pole, if there's anything wrong, it explodes. And so I was talking to Dao Tran, the former book series editor at VOW, in that space while electric poles were exploding around me. What I explained to Voice of Witness at that time, that as a university professor, for whom all of the students at the university were impacted by this disaster, I wanted to create a disaster pedagogy, a way to use oral history to support students. And so we had a course. I designed a course that was the Voice of Witness course. There are 17 narratives in this book, and 8 narratives began in that class with student interviewers, and we brought those narratives to a publishable level through quite a bit of hard work on the parts of students, and then myself and my co-editor Marcy Denisak editing the work, and then Dao Tran helping us with those edits. I say that to you to give you a little bit of background to how this book took shape. When I went into the Voice of Witness classroom, I was very much fist shaking and saying, FEMA let us down, the US government let us down. This book has to be very focused on the absolute crime of abandonment after disaster that was perpetrated by the US government. And my student collaborators said to me, Profe, yes, but how about we talk about heroes? How about we talk about the neighbor, the grandma, the best friend who came through? And their acts of heroism will celebrate the people while showing the absence. And so the way that this book came together was really through that collaboration with students. The person who you're seeing on this slide began as a stranger, Laurel Cubano Santiago, who I reached out to because I had heard that in the underserved neighborhood of La Perla, she had taken all of the refuse and pulled it together in the middle of the street for a barbecue to cook food for the people in her neighborhood who were starving, and she set up a delivery system for elders who could not attend. And so I will read a little bit from Laurel's narrative now. In the days after the hurricane, I went to all the neighbors. It was complete devastation everywhere. So many wooden houses were just wiped out. The streets were littered with wood and metal roofs. So my partner, Christian, I, and other neighbors worked together. We cleaned, we cooked, and we started rebuilding. We cut poles that had fallen and got them out of the way. We cut the tree that had fallen in front of the plaza, and we started cooking with the wood, doing barbecues. We took all the food that we had and cooked it for a big dinner with the neighbors. Every day we cooked outside. We also started doing breakfast from the gallery space. We had a list of elders who couldn't come to the center, and we took food to them. That was the priority, to bring food for the elders before anybody else would eat. At that time, all the work in this community was done by the community. People across the island are still struggling every day. In our neighborhood, there are still people who haven't had their homes rebuilt. Some people are living in the one room or a part of their house that survived the hurricane. Some are living in another person's house, and some have had to leave. My dream right now for our struggling communities would be that we could make money and rebuild our homes. For me, my neighborhood, La Perla, will thrive if it is not gentrified, and if the people here can support themselves and have dignity. That's all we're asking for. Everybody should have dignity.
Thank you to Risha, Fanny, and Jessica for sharing, for reading those quotes. And I want to extend a lot of gratitude to our narrators. Even though they're not, physically here in the Zoom, we have so much gratitude for them, for their bravery, for their vulnerability in sharing their voices with us. So want to say a big thank you to Sharad, to Vanessa, to Laurel. We're so grateful to our narrators for sharing their stories with us. And oral history is about this deep storytelling, right? And so we want to acknowledge these are very, very short excerpts to people's stories. There's so much more to read, but we wanted to give people a chance to engage with oral history. And so I see some folks have already started, but if people want to share a word or a phrase in the chat to describe your response to hearing these excerpts. I'm seeing people saying things like powerful, energizing, impactful, moving, real. Yeah, it's different, I think, so much when you hear someone who's lived through something, when they're talking about the level of detail of things that they're thinking about. Those don't get covered often if we're just reading a news article or it's being covered in the mainstream. People are using the words care. Absolutely. I think the care of the interviewers, the care of the narrators and sharing their story, vivid, some more powerful, heroic, absolutely. Risha was talking about the heroes to uplift during these moments of community resistance and resilience. Moral clarity, right? I think it's absolutely a great way to put that, of really, highlighting what is important and how people are taking care of each other. Actionable, connective, authentic, and nuanced. And someone put hopeful, our stories will live. Thank you all so much for taking the time to reflect. I want to move on now to talking a bit more about the oral history process itself. We've had a chance to engage with some brief examples of oral history, and we're talking about, why we think it's so important. So right now, I'm really excited to have a conversation with Risha where we talk a bit more about what does this process look like. And so we're going to use the example of developing memoria that Risha is going to walk us through. But as an overview, the steps in the oral history process include project planning. Something you hear us say a lot in our trainings is that so much work happens before you turn on the recording button, before you do an interview. Sometimes that's people's first initial reaction where they think oral history starts, but there's so much project planning. We'll talk about creating relationships, relationships built around trust for narrators, the actual act of interviewing, thinking about storytelling questions, all the preparation that goes into the interview and the follow-ups, and then what happens after the interview, transcribing and editing, continuing to honor your narrators, collaborating, and then after you finish quote unquote the oral history product, how do you it's never truly done, but what happens after, right? What is that work, the life after it? How do you archive? How do you share? So those are an overview of the steps. But I want to ask Risha to walk us through some of these main ones. So Risha, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what it was like to connect with narrators. And I know you just gave the example of Laurel, who you had heard about, but a question we get a lot is like, well, how do you find people or to do an oral history project? Or people are like, I know I want to do a project, but I'm not sure like how to go about reaching out to people. Can you talk about a little bit how you established that trust and found narrators to participate in this project?
Yeah, we have two main streams that we follow. when interviewing people. The first is that we teach courses at the university that have an oral history project as part of the curriculum. We use a decolonial pedagogical umbrella model, which sounds like super fancy and weird, but what that means is that we create a framework in the classroom and we say, hey, we are very interested in talking about climate justice, and we understand climate justice to be first the situation of environmental racism that positions people as vulnerable to these extreme weather events and the weather events themselves, but also what's tied to that. After a weather event, such as a hurricane makes landfall, there is an economic crisis, there is an agroeconomic crisis, there is an education crisis. So we're looking at that whole thing. And so we set that up as a context for our students, but we never assign interviews within that. Part of this project is developing a sense of agency in our students and helping them to understand that their voice is powerful, but also the voice that they want to share or facilitate through an oral history interview is up to them. And so within that framework of climate justice that I just explained, students are able to propose their own narrators. And this becomes incredibly useful in multiple ways. And one of those ways is that the students are oftentimes picking a person who they already have a relationship with. And so the oral history interview becomes conversational at a level that perhaps it wouldn't be otherwise. So that's one stream that we follow: the classroom, the student, the pedagogical model. For us at this point, we've become established enough in our communities that we have people reaching out to us, inviting us to please work with them to document some of those stories. However, in the urgent aftermath of Hurricane Maria, I will freely admit that I probably made every single mistake that a beginning oral historian or a beginning crisis oral historian can. And I hesitate to say every mistake because now I'm sure there's a mistake out there that I haven't made yet that will come and find me. The one thing, and I'm sure Ella will ask me some questions that will open the door for me to talk about some of those mistakes, which are learning experiences. But I would say that one of the things that we did very right, that I'm very proud of, and that we continue to do, is that we understand that crisis oral history is related to times of great need. And I'm very proud of the fact that my whole team and all of the students who I work with are very committed to the question, what can I do to help? And we understand that while we want to record stories, we want to preserve stories, we want to amplify stories, the thing that is first and foremost important is protecting people. If we want to talk about food insecurity, we have to make sure that the people we are going to speak to are fed. If we want to talk about people in vulnerable homes, we have to organize resources for the people in vulnerable homes to help them get on their feet. And so for us, and we have a statement of ethics, I see that the OHL URL just flashed up on comments. We have a statement of ethics for working in the aftermath of disaster or during a time of crisis on our website. And it's there very publicly so that anybody who wants to refer to it may certainly do so. But we take care of people first, and I think that that makes people much more willing to speak with us.
Thank you so much, Risha. That was so cool to hear about, like, you're taking care of people, not just as someone you're interviewing. I think that's so important to that narrator collaborator relationship. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about the questions to ask people, both in how you prepare as that interviewer and also how you're preparing, with the narrator to sit down for an interview?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'm kind of laughing to myself because I think that for anybody who's ever conducted an oral history interview, I think you know that you have 10 pages of questions prepared before your interview, and you throw away 9.5 pages of questions once you're sitting in your interview. And so I would personally say that it is very important to do your research ahead of time. If you're going to talk to somebody about food insecurity, make sure that you have prepared yourself and educated yourself about food insecurity in this particular situation, so that you have that conference, so that you have that resource. For example, one of the rivers in Añasco not only breached its banks, but the storm surge from the ocean came back a second time. And so in interviewing people about that storm surge, understanding the nuances that there were 2 layers of that becomes quite important. I know that everybody knows this, but sometimes when you're in the midst of the project, you forget. Dignity and respect are paramount as part of the preparation for any interview. Figuring out how people want to be contacted. I'm a huge academic dork, and so I'm up writing my emails about, hello, I'm happy to meet you. Nobody who's not in academia uses email. Everybody uses WhatsApp or something else. Figure out what is the right and most respectful way to contact your narrator and talk to them. Keep in constant conversation with your narrator. We use a post-custodial archiving model, which means that at any time a narrator feels uncomfortable or unhappy with something in the interview that they have given that we have preserved in our digital archive, they have the right to come back to us and say, I don't want that out there anymore. In the 7+ years that I've been doing this, one time one person said a little chisme about a little gossip about their boss, and came back to me and was like, I feel nervous about the gossip. So it's not something that usually people take advantage of, but it's something that's quite comforting to people to know that their wishes are what's important here. These are not my stories. They're other people's stories that I have been trusted with, and that trust is quite sacred.
Yeah. And so we're talking about all this prep of the interviews. So what's the interview like itself? Especially, how do you take care of the narrator, or, extend care to the narrator, but also take care of yourself when it might be pretty intense, some of the stories that are being shared in this interview?
Sure, sure. I think it's really important to think about what was said at the beginning of this meeting, that the voice of witness model is typically or traditionally a birth till now model. And the birth till now model means that you want to hear that story of the first memory. You want to hear about things that build up to the event that is the main topic of the interview. And that's a trauma-informed approach that says we are not reducing people to that which they survived. And so I think that's really important. And we do testimonio as well. And testimonio is more like the COVID book, which is very focused on witnessing a single episode or instance, but that trauma-informed approach is very important. The other thing is there might be a time in your interview where the person you're speaking with can't remember details. And you might ask a second time and you might not get details. And it's important to remember that one of the things that trauma does to us is it messes with the way we remember things. And I often find in crisis oral history, people want to talk to me. People want to tell me the story. People want to tell me what happened. But sometimes I'll get to the place where details cannot be remembered. And if I ask twice and details cannot be remembered, I tend to take that as a sign that this is a traumatic memory that somebody has not processed yet and is not ready to speak about. And so I think it's experience of just watching for that, and I get very involved in stories. I love what I do. I love to hear people tell their stories. I'm like, and then what happened? And then what happened? And so one of the kindnesses you can do for a narrator is that active listening, where if you find that they cannot come up with those details, that could be a warning sign that this is not something that they are ready to speak about yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you do the interview, then there's a whole other stage, which people sometimes don't necessarily think about, the transcribing and the editing. So can you talk about what it's like, to take a raw transcript and then to edit it, you're working with someone else's voice. How do you edit but still honor the narrator's voice?
Yeah, that is a great question, Ella and Dow and I and Katie Powell, another editor of a book in the Vow series, worked on a collaborative essay for the oral history review in which we talked about the ethics of editing, which is part of what's happening here. And in our case, we're also translating. Our lab is fully bilingual Spanish English. And about 2/3 of our interviews are conducted in Spanish, about 1/3 in English. There's an infinitesimal part there that's Dutch or French or Papiamento or something like that. And so we really need to spend a great deal of time with our narrators, having them check at every stage. And sometimes what that means is that we have to sit down and discuss in depth what we've done with transcribing sounds, which I think are very important to oral history interviews, transcribing people's ways of speaking and even colloquialism. So for example, in one of our interviews, we have an elder from Aguadilla who is repeatedly saying a word that is very old-timey Aguadilla Spanish, and the translation is like, gosh, shucks, darn. And it's absolutely not an appropriate translation for what this person is trying to say. So we do think a lot about, even though we're working in two languages, how do we honor originary language as a means of dignity and respect and decolonial practice. I have sort of come up with a very loose rule that I don't translate food anymore, because food is such a cultural expression of love that I don't want to be like, sweet coconut rice pudding. And so I want that originary language there. And so these are decisions that everybody has to make for their project, but that goes back to the idea of what the student said to me about honoring things and making the decision about what do you want to honor in your project.
Thanks, Risha. It's so clear that care is such an important aspect of this throughout, before the interview, and editing. I know we're coming up against time soon, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what archiving and sharing. You talked about how the project is never done. What's it like to have the stories out there and be part of the community?
Yeah, so I will say, just my first big mistake was archiving. What is archiving? And I did not realize at the time that I started my project that we as oral historians need to think about how are we preserving our project. So now we have a digital repository and we function as a hub for the Puerto Rican archipelago and the Caribbean archipelago, as a means of supporting other folks who might be in the same position that I was in, saying, hey, what should happen? And then we really came up against this idea that when you're talking about things like the climate crisis, systemic racism, intergenerational colonial practices, archiving is very important, but we cannot wait for people to find the stories in the archive. If we want to end systemic racism, if we want to end colonial practice, if we want to mitigate the climate crisis, we have to make sure that people are reading our stories or connecting with our stories somehow. And so we've really dedicated ourselves to the curation of qualitative community-based data in our stories. Now, as a humanist, that sounds very technical, and I promise you, I don't science. I might science adjacent sometimes, but I don't science. And so we've worked very hard on an integrated high-tech, low-tech, and no-tech dissemination model. And so we did a storytelling project in La Perla with Laurel and had an artist work with the narratives to pull out parts of those stories, paint a mural on a community center in La Perla with QR codes embedded in the mural that link to the stories. So our philosophy is that we might have the greatest stories in the world, but if they're not getting in front of people, they're not doing the things that we hope they can do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Risha. I know this was a quick, pretty compressed conversation, but it's so great to hear all the different insights that you have and the care that is involved in this project. Definitely encourage folks to pick up Me Maria, to check out the Oral History Lab. We have the link in the chat to learn more about this project. I'm going to pass it over now to Fanny to talk a little bit more about some of the ethical considerations that are part of thinking about oral history. Oh, sorry. Over to you, Fanny.
I just want to acknowledge that we're coming close to time, but we want to make sure to give you as much information as we wanted to give you today. If you need to go because you have something else pending, it's okay. We're recording this. We'll send you the recording. But this conversation with Risha was so powerful, and I had to write down what you said, which is, if you're going to interview people who have experienced food insecurity, you have to make sure people are fed. And I think that that is like a great example of what ethical storytelling and oral history gathering means. It's not just about collecting the stories, it's also about caring and co-creation and transparency about the process, because without the narrator, there would be no interviewer and there would be no oral history project. So please keep that in mind, and I encourage you to seek out Val's ethical storytelling principles as a resource for guidance. We'll put it in the chat, and also you can find it on our website. And besides the oral history book series, Val also has a book with practical guidance on how to create an oral history project. It's called Say It Forward, A Guide to Social Justice Storytelling. And of course, seek out Me Maria, Risha, and Marcia's excellent collection of oral histories about the hurricane in the archipelago. You can purchase it through Haymarket. And Val is also available to provide customizable trainings and consulting services for anyone who seeks to start or launch or develop an oral history project. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ella again.
All right. Thank you so much, Fanny. I know that we only have a few more minutes left. So if people want to continue to share questions, if we don't get to everything right now, we'll follow up by email. I see that there's a couple questions in the chat that we'll try to get to before we close. Robin asked, how can this work intersect with performative storytelling? This is a great question. Performance and theater is such a great venue for connecting to oral histories. People often use the transcript or the edited oral histories as monologues. I've worked with Berkeley Rep and East Bay Sanctuary Covenant in Berkeley, California, where we've done trainings with different immigrant community members where they've worked on oral history storytelling workshops and then ended up doing a monologue and almost like a movement-based performance with their own words. And so we've had other collaborations where people have taken the oral history narratives, created monologues, and created a play out of it. I think there's so much that you can do with using the words as a foundation for movement, for theater. There really are, so many examples. I think that's a great question. Somebody else asked, I'm interested why the quotes are read rather than using the actual voices. Great question. So Val follows a literary form of oral history. And so that involves, we were talking about editing, a lot of editing. So often when you read an excerpt, even if it's short in an oral history project, those sentences could have been taken from many different places in an interview. Part of editing means honoring that narrator's voice so that we can take, in person when you sit down for an interview, people are bouncing all over the place in time and space in their conversation, but it's not necessarily, digestible or readable for someone to just read in 10 pages. So a lot of editing happens. So we often pull from different parts of the interview to create a really cohesive, chronological, final narrative that's easy for people, for the reader to understand, that you might not get that cohesion if you're listening to audio. Sometimes, like in Sharad's example, we couldn't do a sit down audio. He actually shared his story with the editor Mateo through written correspondence because he was incarcerated. So sometimes it's a limitation that is posed on a narrator for the situation. Sometimes also the audio quality is also just not very good, to be completely honest, in terms of people are recording on their phones in busy places. It's not necessarily, we're able to kind of share it in the context like this. But there are other forms of oral history where people do share their audio. So that's Val's approach to do it in a literary way, but some people do really focus on, like StoryCorps, for example. They're an audio-based oral history project. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Well, I know that we're at 3 o'clock right now, so we want to respect everyone else's time. My apologies for questions that we weren't able to get to, but we will follow up with them over email. And so I'm going to pass it over. We don't have time for our reflections, though there are a lot of reflections in the chat, which I appreciate from everybody. But I'm going to pass it over to Jessica to wrap us up just in the next minute. So here's to Jessica.
Yes, quickly, just as folks are signing off, I've been seeing in the chat that a lot of people want to know more. They want to get in touch with us to potentially collaborate on a project or get some support. So here is some of the information that you need and some ways to stay in touch with us. Of course, please donate if that's within your means so that we can continue offering webinars like this one if you enjoyed it. If you are interested in working with us, you can follow the link that is dropped in the chat. You can also reach out directly to Ella, who manages our community partnerships at ella@voiceofwitness.org. We will be offering more webinars like this and going more in depth into the interview process, building relationships with narrators, editing. So if you want to attend more webinars, sign up for our newsletter. You'll get notified about when those dates are coming up. And of course, follow us on social media. We're on all the channels and you can stay in touch with our goings on that way. Thank you all so much for being here. It's been a pleasure listening to your reflections and just being in community with you all. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we hope to hear from all of you.
Thank you all so much. This was great being with you for this past hour. Thanks for all your great and reflections and questions. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.